Welcome. This is the second of our series of the Saint Macrina Centre occasional gatherings, where we are thinking about precious words within the Eastern Christian tradition, words which sometimes have been buffeted about, sometimes abused, but which bear remarkable sort of landscapes of meaning. So today, our colleague Andrew Bingham will open up for us, walk around a word that in the modern world has had its meaning reduced dramatically. The word authority, and how that word, what the embodied meaning, how that word has been made flesh within the tradition of the Christian East. So we're delighted to see you all, and appreciate that you're walking us into this, Andrew.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And thank all of you for being here. If we're to think together, we need to be together. And so we need to be present and open. This is, in a way, this talk on authority, which will meander a little bit between this and that aspect. This is, in a way, a second consideration of authority. Last year, we did a series in the same occasional gatherings on recent monks and theologians in the church. And I gave a talk on Saint Silouan and Saint Sophrony. And that was really the beginning of opening up this question of...
Dr. Andrew Brigham, you're getting some flashes on your screen.
In that earlier address, we tried to consider the question of authority in terms of voice, and in particular, tonality of voice or tonality of being. And there, through thinking with Saint Sophrony and Saint Silouan, we were seeking a method of drawing forth word from the beautiful silence of the Logos. In other words, a word from within the horizon of Christ, or a word appropriate for the tradition. A word appropriate for the tradition would be a word of its own, which would mean a word of our own, which would also mean a word of his own. And that linking, creation's own, our own, his own, is at the heart of what we're talking about today. But as I said, this is elemental thinking. It seeks ultimates, but it's meant to be with the elements of thought. So we're careful. In his book, The ABC of Reading, Ezra Pound, the great Ezra Pound, writes about comprehension, and he refers to the great scholar Fenellosa and his study of Chinese characters. And Pound is a polymath, but he's referring to an erudite scholar who is learning from. And Pound remarks that in a Chinese character, they're built. There's movement built in. And his reference is towards man and tree and sunshine together, which form the kind of complex meaning east, right? Sunrise, the man tree, the sunrise is in the east. And Pound says, what happens when the movement in this character is stilled into identification, into a kind of immediate surface? So the texture, the movement, the vitality of it is missed. All you get is the, I guess, what it signals. We know, and we began thinking this way last time, we know that all is moving in creation. All is kinetic. All is flow. But how can we recognize movement or flow appropriately? apart from a deep and enduring participation in the flow of tradition, the moment is often mistakenly identified with the passion that seems to be connected to it, right? Apart from a deep participation in the flow of tradition, all we have is the passionately immediate moment, and we respond to it. We'll hold that in mind. So let's ask, what is the question of authority? What are we asking here? What is the question of authority? What makes a word authoritative? And then some kind of cognates or friends of authoritative. What makes a word felt or integral or true or false or counterfeit or self-idolatrous or critical or irresponsive or irresponsible or insincere? The same word is said. No movement is discerned, just that surface Pound is talking about. So the question of authority is also, in a way, how we deform a word beyond its own. How we deform a word beyond its own. Now, when we're speaking of an insincere word or a true word or a hail word or a co-responsive word, in a way, we are beginning to address the ethos of the person, right? Because here, the question pertains both to utterance and to the utterer, to the word and to the voice or the person. So maybe the beginning of our exploration of this concept is the question of integrity. Integrity, soundness or wholeness of character. What makes a word our own? But integrity in Christianity is also the question of concentration, gathering one's energy under the center of one's being, gathering unto a stance of giving forth. Concentration. Ultimately, in our tradition, concentration means transfiguration, but we're talking about a kind of aspect of it now. So concentration, or gathering unto the center. What is the center of authority? Where's its center? Now, often, because of the lovely play of the word in English, but also because of habits of mind, we hear the word author in authority. Author, right? Fair enough. Source or origin. Source or origin. We avoid images like the clockmaker that makes and winds the clock and sets it free. That's not what we mean by authority. Nor the kind of authority with which a novelist, let's say, manipulates or pretends his characters are free. But the idea of author or source or origin, in Greek, source or origin is translated by the word aitia. Aitia. Last time we spoke, we said that as we do not know beyond movement, we know only within movement, then our consideration of source or aitia is not its kind of the essence of it, but the movement of it. If we think of source or origin as having a direct movement from, this is the language of cataphasis, and it is the realm of aesthesis or ascesis in tradition. If we think of the movement from the source or origin, aitia, in terms of the word of, this is of that. This is apophatic, and this is more the noetic register of life. But often we think of authority something to do with source or origin. And maybe even origin, energy, and economia together form a little unit of authority: origin or source, energy, and economia. Maybe. But even considering the source or the origin of plain things is difficult. I've delved into this frequently in considered form. But if we think of the origin of a gesture, right? The great filmmakers Strobe and Huye, in one of their films called Where Does Your Hidden Smile Lie? It's about the Portuguese filmmaker Pedro Costa. It's a brilliant film. They're editing a film of theirs and they're trying to see where a glint in the eye and a smile originates in the film shot. And it originated in the movement of the hand, actually. The hand transferred up to the glint and the smile. Right? Anyone who studied or watched boxing knows that the punch begins somewhere deep inside, maybe the small of the back or maybe the leg somewhere. It doesn't begin just in the fist. Right? If we think of stance, physical stance, the origin of our stance or the source of our stance is rendered complex when we realize that there are orthotics, and the slightest shift in the shape of the heel of the sole of your foot changes everything. Or staying with the body, the source of pain in the body. We know that what hurts is sometimes, often, frequently not the actual source of the pain. So this is why we have to be careful trying to distinguish, do we know it's directly from, the source from, or if it is more of a mystery, of an of. Concentration and our own. What is the gift of creation? What is blessed as our own? Well, two things. Well, many things, but two things here. First, the gift of creation is a revelation of the incarnate God. And it is also a revelation of life as loving, joyful communion. Now, the concentration of our being as a gift from God means our own is as his own. We referred to this language last time. We are as his own. We are also of Christ's own. Right? We are as his own in creation. In other words, the presence of our being, of each being, is holy. But we are also of his own, thine own of thine own, because the meaning of our being is holy as well. Right? So we're thinking word, voice, concentration, our own is as and of his own. Well, if we are as and of his own, what is Christ's own? And here we are extremely careful, but we can turn to things that he said to us gently. Things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The whole beginning, the path, and the vitality of it. That's a beautiful one. It's well known. That we could see how that could be authoritative. And that's easy for us. He also says, learn of me, for I am meek and mild. It might be harder for us to see how that is authoritative because our habits often counter that. We say, yeah, Christ is meek and mild, but I have to insist. And so thinking about the word I for a moment, I mean, we hear our Savior speak, and we know that our being is formed of and as his own. But let's pause over the horizon of this word I for a little bit, which has become confused with authority. I and authority. Looking back, kind of lightheartedly looking back, casting back, all the way back to the Romans. The Romans granted the individual legal rights, right? A huge step, very significance. That's one of the first transformations of I, the word I. Then, in the Protestant Reformation, skipping ahead quite a bit, the individual was granted divine intimacy, right? Every individual was assumed to be kind of as close as anyone else to God. So God became private, as it were. With the Renaissance, we forgot about God. We became God. So this is the individual as intimately divine, not intimate with the divine, with God, but intimately. I'm a genius, right? That kind of thing. And then with contemporary, by contemporary I mean the last 300 years, liberalism, which is primarily what we have in the English-speaking world and the West. And this is the individual as the sole source of truth. In our time, it's even odder. One could almost say that each sentence beginning with I becomes irrefutable and unanswerable because I know and my truth is absolute. I. So what do we have here? We have an I which has begun to idolize its own experience. But then we think, what is this form of experience? We are taught, because of life and creation being a gift, we are taught in the church that our form of experience is response. That is, it is to be in relation, and especially loving, thankful relation. So when we make the I the center of everything, especially experience, it deforms experience, makes it unresponsive, but instead assertive. In the last talk, we said that how we respond to an experience grants the horizon of meaning for that experience. Our response grants the horizon of meaning for what we undergo. When we co-respond within our experience to the love of Christ, that provides the transformation of experience. So response as the beginning and co-response as the deepening of our understanding of experience is very, very different than the I, which is absolute and total. But then we say, if this is the teaching, if our essence is responsive, then let's turn back to the word authority for a moment. Authority. One of the Greek words by which authority is translated into English is exousia, out of the essence, or of the essence, flowing out of the essence. And so we could, as a kind of side note, we could say, well, leave that for a moment. Flowing out of the essence. Curiously, one of the words for freedom in Greek, a play on that, is autoexousia, autoexousia, right? The self which emerges out of the essence of that deeper participation, the play of the ecstasis of the essence. Here, whether out of the essence or the play of the ecstasis of the essence, we are still thinking of authority and freedom as flow, right? Either from the being the image of Christ to being as Christ, or logos to tropos. That's a flow. It's not a disjunction there. I'm using the word flow to kind of mean integral connection of movements. It's a prosaic word. How do we interrupt this flow? Or how do we deform this flow from source to presence? We can interrupt this flow through anecdotes and footage. This is a critical move, right? We disconnect the of from the as. Right? We say, yeah, this person is of Christ and made as Christ, but look at this anecdote, look at this footage. And the footage or the anecdote, which seeks to, bifurcate life and make it make a passionate portion stand in for the whole. It is extraordinarily common in public life now, especially manipulations of public life. It's interrupting the flow. It's saying, pause here and make this absolute. We can also deform this flow. And this is by way of versions or renditions. When we seek to confine the logos within a tropos. This is identification of our own experience with experience in general. Broadly speaking, just to give a couple examples of this, broadly speaking, the ecclesial gathering of the Eucharistic community is the center of Christian authority. That's the life and the center of Christian authority, the ecclesial gathering of the Eucharistic community. This is a phrase you can read throughout the tradition in every place possible. That's where we're taught. Now, think about that reduced to an abstraction, either interrupted or deformed. Think about abstracting from a lived context. So abstracting from the voice to just the word doesn't, and at that point, the word can be insincere or dismissive or critical or arrogant or false or true because there's no context for it. This is how we find theology in our church reduced to, let's say, academic exercises for paying people in a university that's select. It's an abstraction from the living scene of life and struggle to one of articulation which doesn't need to participate. There's no need to participate. This strange model becomes even stranger when we think of something like a conference. So even further removed from the ecclesial gathering of the Eucharistic community. In a conference, we have hundreds of people come, all needing to be right and everyone else wrong on their subject matter. I have to be right because it's for a job and I have to get ahead. I have to look better than you. It is a form built on the identification of truth and I and experience, and also of negation of the other person. I think kind of broadly for a moment of ways that authority has been considered. Sometimes it is thought of as standard and economia or dispensation, right? Rule and dispensation. This was explored in the talk I gave you on Silouan and Sophrony, where we wondered, is maybe the height of authority loving gentleness, i.e. the application of economia? That seems to me pretty close to the height of authority, knowing when to apply economia, which is always responsive and always in the moment and always concrete, never abstract, and it's always gentle, meek, and mild. So we could think of authority as standard and economia. Also, sometimes it's helpful to think of authority as a unity of ground, measure, and horizon, right? The ground that you stand on, the measure that ground gives, and the horizon, what that allows you to see. If you have all of those integrally understood, you're authoritative in that. That's to speak of authority as a kind of formation. We might return to this question at the end. Is authority via formation from within? Or is authority from without in terms of necessity? Now, necessity makes freedom a negative. It deforms freedom in its own image. It makes freedom individual, right? Because if something's necessary, then to be free, you have to negate that necessity. Right? But because it's responding to that necessity, the freedom is in the image of negation, necessity. So it's wrapped up with it. And because necessity is thorough and escape is individual, freedom becomes individual, a question of me making it. Freedom might be figured not in connection with necessity, though, but in connection with play. And this is something we want to think about for the rest of the time. Play. Play, the play of one's whole being, not of an instrument or something, some object, the play of one's whole being. And this is a good expression of freedom because it depends on no negative counterpart. It doesn't negate anything to be free. It just is free. And in this way, play is often transformative for us. It's not bound to necessity. Authority is not bound to necessity either. So perhaps authority is transformative as well. We can say that the tradition is authoritative because it transforms us in the light of Christ. It teaches us to play. It doesn't teach or instill in us a mode of critique or a mode of dialectic or of debates or negation. That's not what Christ teaches us. He teaches us joy. Last time we talked a little bit about critique and cleverness, these two ways that I think that we can respond poorly to the tradition. And I want to give two examples of that, both from the Brothers Karamazov. First, critique or critical. This is the figure of the Grand Inquisitor. This is well-known, a well-known figure. The Grand Inquisitor corrects Christ. He says, yeah, you got most of it, but I had to help out. Right? And therefore, he corrupts, this is what we mean by corruption in Orthodoxy, and counterfeits Christ's truth. He offers a false light. False light is one of the, or delusion, is one of the matters closest to authority in our tradition. Because false light or delusion is the question of erring. And the Grand Inquisitor, some people think he's just talking about authority, but remember, he deforms authority and miracle and mystery. All of these are very good things. He deforms them all. So he's not a figure of authority that stands, no, he's deforming authority and deforming mystery and deforming miracle, all of which are blessed, good things. So he's a kind of critical figure, a figure of death. He deals death with where there's life. But there's a clever figure in the Brothers Karamazov too, who, well, he doesn't deal death instead of life. He says the best version of life is riotous living. So here we go. This is Fyodor Pavlovich, the father figure. He's clever. A lot of his talk sounds kind of like he. Look at those monks. He. Look at those priests. He. Right? It's a kind of putative, clever stance that claims to see through the weakness of Christians and mocks everyone but himself as hypocritical. At least I'm honest in my sin. These monks and these priests, they blah, 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 right? This is an irresponsible word. The first, critique. Last time we said that negation is delusion because it's not necessary. Critique here is casting down, pulling down creation for an abstraction. Cleverness here is a form of identification. and therefore irresponsibility. Because if you identify yourself with the truth, you're not responsible beyond yourself to anything else. We said last time, identification is a form of nonsense. And the clever person often wants to usurp the truth of relation and communion to one's own self-image alone. I'm a sinner, but I understand better than all these people, right? He. Mock, mock, mock. Both of these, critique and cleverness, they're forms of condescension, and they both claim to be authoritative. Condescension. I have to condescend because I am above. This again smacks of necessity. Necessity has another difficulty for the tradition, and that is it tends to deform our sense of obedience. Right? We can think that obedience means having to do something that you have to do because you have to do it. You don't want to, but you have to do it. Because the other person has more authority. So I have to do it. Obedience doesn't have to mean that, and it ought not to mean that. We learned last time that just looking it up in the OED, I mean, it's right there. Obedience means listing towards. It means renewing one's disposition in the direction of. It means inclining one's ear to the truth of something, which really changes how someone like Fyodor Pavlovich might laugh at a monk's obedience, right? Obedience, listening towards, inclining one's ear, renewing one's soul in the direction of. Obedience clarifies fire. And the soul, which is a flame, partakes of the love of Christ. Obedience begins participation in Christ, and participation means synergy. And synergy is the unending flow of our communion with God, begun before we know and completed in a way we cannot know. It means theosis. Synergy is the finest example of flow. Now, the healing process of synergy deepens our attunement to the tradition and to each other. It deepens our sense of responsibility. And the critical word and the clever word are both irresponsible words. The critical word uses an image to denigrate another, prove them wrong, right? You say this, but no, you're wrong. The clever word uses an image to either exalt oneself or denigrate someone else, prove them false, right? At least I'm not false. We both struggle, but at least I'm not false. Both misuse images given in the church. And this is part of the reason why these kinds of things are best comprehended only by long and often quiet participation in the tradition. Because tradition evens things out for us. We're not jolted by its strong images or its kind of dire phrases. We're at peace because we know the whole. We're not excited, we're not passionate, we're not taking one moment of footage, or we're not just listening to an anecdote about some image or some vision or some fantasy that is meant to inflame us passionately. One of these things that we have to be careful of is the idea of power. Authority is often identified with power, I think. And we know now identification is a form of nonsense. So immediately that's not right. Even power, though. Power, what does it mean? When David said earlier, authorities become deformed in our day into certain insistence or force. This is what is meant. But power That word, when it stands alone, power, it sounds scary. When we have it in the phrase of the tradition, though, dynamo, dynamis, a kind of furnace of attentive desire, it changes the aspect. One of the questions of authority is how to hold the images, the phrases, the concentrations of tradition, how to hold them peacefully. One has to be careful with strong fire, and there's no stronger fire than that of Christ. Long, steady participation is needed for discernment. And this, in a way, is why we speak about phrasing meaning. Phrasing rather than stating or articulating or uttering rather. Phrasing. Phrasing means to gather and relate things as beautiful, like a musical phrase. Both as beautiful on their own, but also beautifully of God's own. And phrasing, because the tradition rather is synergetic. When we're phrasing tradition, as we're striving to do now, tradition is also phrasing us. It's a form of participation. It's not one way. And this flow, this phrasing and being phrased is the process of transformation. The transformation is not the same for everyone. When it's not individualized, it's in relation, in communion, but it's not identical. And so when we meet another person, we know that if they're struggling, and everyone is struggling somehow, this transformation is occurring in them somehow, if they're looking to Christ. But in the whole of their being, not just one aspect that we can see or that we think is the most prominent now. And so we're careful, again, not to rely on footage or anecdotes or versions of things, right? How do we discern the play of Christ in our struggles and joys as Christians? How do we discern it in ourselves and in others? We do not anticipate. We don't anticipate how it is or where it is or that kind of thing. But we seek the joy of Christ in each countenance we meet. And as we live, I mean, this doesn't just apply regarding when we meet another person, it applies to ourselves too. As we live and are in fellowship with each other, how may we discern whether or not our own being is of Christ? That's also not a question of identification. It's not, we must work, brothers. That's all. That's what's given to us. So we work and we know the person in front of us is working and we seek to partake of the joy of Christ in them as they do in us. Now, the question of authority, as we have framed it in parts, is the unity of our tropos, our mode of being, with the logos, the meaning of our being. As soon as mode differs from revealed meaning, and Christianity is a revealed mystery, then we err. We err when our tropos and our logos are not as one. When the divine image is not related to the divine likeness in us, when we divorce those two. And so in Orthodoxy, truth is often figured in personal terms, as a revelation of personhood, or what it means to be human, an incarnate being with others. And we learn of our Savior. I am the way, the truth. No one comes to the Father but by me. But that's strong, that's very strong fire. So we can turn to slightly lesser fire too. Dostoevsky says that love fulfills our being. And he also says, in a way that I didn't understand until just as we're thinking together now, these days, that we are each responsible for all. It's a line which is always just stood out in that, but this is what it has to be. This is what it means. Bakhtin, the great reader of Dostoevsky, speaks of the person as a kind of open unity or as dialogic, and he refers to being as communion. These are the echoes, the realizations of this way of thinking. In our tradition, both person and tradition are understood to be a kind of rooted openness or open rootedness, both rooted, right, but also open, flowering and open to the elements and welcoming them. Not swaying in the moment, but responding with roots. We could also say it has a kind of center and play. The center is the logos, the play is the tropos. This idea of rooted openness, or center and play, logos and tropos, means that within the horizon of Christ, as taught and lived by the Church, all emphases are blessed, as and of Christ's very own. And so authority is not confined to, let's say, one who speaks necessarily, or one who serves, or blesses. It's not kind of classifiable like that. It's somehow everywhere and filling all things. I want to refer to something a brother of mine said, and then I want to talk about the desert briefly. This is circling back to that idea of the Chinese character and the cessation of movement and what happens when you stay on the surface, of identification, of center and play or root and openness, of logos and tropos, of concentration. But my brother said a while ago, why not do something well for its own sake? That to me seems a perfect expression of authority. Do something well for its own sake. And we know from the beginning, for its own sake means for the sake of creation, which means for our own sake, which means for God's own sake, insofar as we comprehend those things. When all of that is together, that's probably a fair way of trying to understand authority just now. My brother also said something else which surprised me, and I've just keep returning to it because it's so astonishing. It still is. He is very capable musically, and I have a room full of instruments in my house. And I thought he'd play one or two. And he said, I find instruments alienated and alienating. And there's some truth there which I still don't fully understand. And there's some phrasing of authority there which is more than we're saying now. What I understand, I think, a little bit. Instrument here means something like prosthesis, right? It allows one to be false, as it were, not one's own. And by that, I mainly mean instruments in this sense can augment feeling, unnaturally augment feeling, i.e., portray feeling that we are not feeling in the moment, in a way that fragments concentration. So it heightens, it's like ecstasis in a way that threatens or fragments concentration. Alienated and alienated. Very, very interesting. It's an aphorism of the desert, that way of speaking. Same as doing something well for its own sake. The desert literature in our tradition is my very, very favorite reading. And that's probably why these phrases have lingered in my mind. Metaphor of instruments, metaphor of deserts. If an instrument can take us beyond our own, does the deserts take us more deeply into our own? And this is a metaphor again. The deserts is that aspect or place of creation filled either with light or with darkness. And when the monks of the desert talk about the cell, their cell, where they live, the cell for us means our particular portion, our particular gift, the place, the people God has granted us to be next to. In the light of the desert, things become distinct. And in the clarity of the desert, relations become distinct. The horizon of the desert means relations become synergy. And the clearing of the desert means synergy is blessed as communion. And in a way, that's a kind of way of phrasing the authority of the desert, right there. Aphorisms, apohorismo, gathered from the horizon, apohorismos. Aphorisms of the desert, that which is gathered from the horizon of the desert, that place of synergy and communion, are my very favorites. And I want to end with one of my favorite lines from the desert. It stands alone, it's spiritual counsel, but the context is not our interest right now. One father said to another, "Be as an exile and do not desire to be listened to." Be as an exile and do not desire to be listened to. Only in this way is one sound and not fragmented through passionate interest. Especially that second, do not desire to be listened to, is such a hard lesson for us now and probably impossible or nigh, but it's very good to keep in mind. Integral, concentrated, as and of his own, with long participation in the liturgical rhythms of the Church's tradition, unswayed by strong images due to the even stronger fire of synergy, which inwardly forms and transforms our being, we draw near to God. And the nearer we draw and are drawn, the more we correspond with the love of Christ. And this correspondence with the love of Christ is the heart of spiritual authority for Eastern Christianity. So the question is only deepened. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit now. We might begin anywhere with a question like this, and we try to dance around this question in this little talk. Sometimes we think authority means something, we have to define it strongly first and then get rid of all that it is not. And sometimes we think, let's explore all the things that it is not first and then clear away room until we get to what it is. Both of those are standard and not bad. The danger is in the first, we get wrapped up in our own experience. And the second, that we begin thinking in terms of critique. And we stay in that mode of it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. It's, in other words, we begin speaking in terms of negation. But let's open it up now. Just go ahead. Yeah, please, please.
Andrew, thanks. This beautiful phrase that you said, maybe say a little bit more about the healing process of synergy deepens our sense of obedience. Say more about healing process. Like I love that phrase. I starred that, and I'm gonna settle into that for a while. But I love that, and just hearing about synergy in general is beautiful to ponder. But yeah, say more about the healing process of synergy and connected to obedience.
This is something too that others present know more than I do. But just to try to clarify a word, that's almost the line. Obedience is the beginning of synergy. I said the healing process of synergy deepens our attunement, but it could also be obedience, because obedience really is kind of like the movement of attunement, right?
Yeah.
But this, I won't put this well, not on purpose. This idea of synergy, to me, is such a great mystery. I can't speak kind of calmly about it. What I understand that the tradition, the church teaches about synergy is that just like we are as and of God's own, Christ's own, and we seek to draw near, the further we draw near, our energy, from the very beginning, our energy is not just our own, the energy of our soul, because it is of Christ and as Christ. But more and more, that energy becomes kind of Christ's energy in us rather than our own energy seeking. So synergy somehow, you have to be very, 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 very careful of images.
Yes.
But it's kind of like when you're doing a relay race, and for a while, when you're passing the baton, you run alongside the other person, and they carry you, as it were, for a little bit, and then you pass, and then imagine that, except that somehow you were just still with them.
Yeah.
Like still with them. So you were that baton. It means that, as I understand it, there's absolutely no need at all to fear death, the end of self, anything like that. Only joy. Because of this gift of creation and of our being, it's this beautiful now, and it is synergetic, i.e. becoming more and more God's own, then the temptation to fear the end of me or my demise or what have you, or death, that becomes kind of, it doesn't occur to one anymore. It's not like that. Because it's not me up to here, stop, God takes over. It's a
Right.
Maximus says, life is carrying and being carried.
Hmm.
And we carry a long time, and then I think just suddenly we start being carried and we don't even know, because we're just so full of joy and gratitude and love.
Hence the long, steady participation and how important that is.
Yeah, that was emphasized today, because that's something we forget.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me, to use another sports metaphor. It's amazing to me how many of us, me included, not separate at all, we think, oh, well, I'll read and talk about Basil the Great, or John Chrysostom, or Jesus Christ, even Jesus Christ himself, right? We glibly just go like that. But we would never think, all right, next time the World Cup's in town, I'll play soccer with Ronaldo. I know how to run, right? Like that wouldn't occur to us. It would be almost
No,
laughable. And yet we
that's
head
what this
straight
is.
into a scripture, the Gospel of John, and we think that that I, which begins all of our sentences, is up to it right away. Synergy teaches us we don't have to think like that. It's not
Mm.
necessary.
Amen. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
valuable. Wow.
No, as well put, well put. Thank you. Thank you. Hmm. Other thoughts, responses? It is funny when you have something like this because we are meant to be thinking together, and thinking cannot be rushed, and yet we're within a time frame. And so it's almost kind of we have to be both natural and unnatural in a sense, force our thoughts a little bit more than we wish to sometimes, but also take the time. Right? This is fire. We don't approach fire lightheartedly.
The synergy in co-working. I'm just kind of meditating on that right now.
Go on.
Just doing a summary of the whole lecture so far. I like the idea of what he said, like overcoming the fear of death, overcoming the fear of one's own ending. You know, we're part of like God's legacy or the unfolding of God's plan, not near exact words. Another Orthodox speaker actually said something, it's like being part of a symphony. You know, like one person writes a part, then someone else writes another part, and someone writes another part. Like it's an ongoing story. You know, it's like reading the Book of Genesis, the prophets, the New Testament, and the Book of Acts. It's one continuous story. Chapters get added. I mean, our lives are that way. We can see our synergetic relationship with God in a similar manner. Yes, we have this life to live, but we have our ancestry. We have those who will come after us. It's a continuing lineage.
Yeah, yeah. And that way of putting it, that way of phrasing it does instill some peace, you
Yep.
know, knowing that it's not all, and it brings to mind two things. I forget who said it. We'll know, someone here will know. But maybe it was someone in this room, in this Zoom room. We need to be, or it could have been Losky, I think it was Losky. We need to be responsible for what we live.
Mm-hmm.
For our faith, we need to be able to respond, to answer for it, right? Bakhtin says, I am answerable with my life for what I have thought. I'm answerable with my life, right? In the tradition, two kind of energies surge, I think. The first is that, well, we need to know and embrace the tradition so we can respond, you know, with knowing and with loving. So we are responsible, like Dostoevsky says, like some of what was said earlier. We're responsible. But there's another, and I've seen this in my brother. There's a deep peace that says, why would you doubt? You know, the truth of Christ won't diminish. There's no need to fear. Of course, gather it, work to make it your own, right? Work to inhabit it, work to have it just saturating thoroughly your whole life, but also be completely free at that point. And I think that's where the do not desire to be listened to comes in, right? To desire someone's ear means you want to have an effect. It's not openness to a mystery. It's not doing something for its own sake. It is, I want to matter to you, and even worse, usually be memorable to you. I want you to remember me and remember me. Right? This is often a way of having ourselves stand in for a larger truth of tradition or something else. Yeah. Synergy, I mean, it's a lovely Greek word. We have the word cooperation too, which doesn't sound as lovely to our ears because we think of it in a more pedestrian way. But it does mean, I mean, the Latinate version of the Greek. You are working and I am working. And somehow that will be in harmony. Hmm. What do we make of that little potted history of I? What did I miss there? We have the Romans. What else is missing? Let's just think right now together. Romans' legal status, right? I went up to the Protestant Reformation after that because that is most palpable to our own, where suddenly the individual is, almost identified. Is there another stage in between them? Hmm. David, what's on your mind? Do you have, or are you pondering and preparing?
Well, you had us all muted, so it's a little hard to ponder. Well, you unfolded this beautifully, Andrew, really beautifully. And there's many things that that move one, but maybe I'll just mention two and ask you to see if they speak a little bit to your meditation on this. And one of them has to do with this matter of obedience and devotion and response. And then the other one is perhaps a little more well, it's also a part of our life together in the world because we also live in institutions. Institutions are important for us. Authority in institutions is important for us, but often we misunderstand it. So the first one, I'm reminded of it because of your use of the term source, which is such a lovely word. I always think of it as I was driving through the eastern townships of Quebec years ago, and in a little mountainous area, and there was a sign pointing source. And of course, in the Rocky Mountains, if you're driving out to Mission, BC, I often do drive out to the monastery there, you come across the source, the water bubbling forth from the depths of the earth. I mean, in and of itself, it is a wonder. So my first sort of response to the way in which you talked about this is associated, I may have mentioned this to you before, but a number of years ago, I was teaching at Newman Theological College, and they were all either women studying for their master's degree who were Anglican and were using it as a way of getting holy orders in the Anglican Church. which I think the Archbishop of the Catholic Church finally realized. Realized maybe he didn't want to support this quite as much as he was. But all the other students were in the seminary, in the St. Joseph's Seminary, in the Catholic seminary. And there was one lovely young man who had studied actually out at the Benedictine monastery, and he'd done his philosophy out at the Benedictine monastery at Mission. His name was, I still remember his name so well. His name was Augustine, because I remember asking him about his mother, Monica, on a number of occasions. How is Monica? She loved you so much. She prayed you into the kingdom. So I have very fond memories of him. I haven't seen him in many, many years. But I thought to myself at the time, you know, at some point you will, God wills, you will be a very fine Catholic bishop. He was from Nigeria. And in the course of our conversations together in the class, it emerged that it was one of his grandparents who became a Catholic. Prior to that, his family was deeply engaged by the local religion. And he talked one day about the other grandparent, his mother's grandfather, or his mother's father, who still was very much within the African indigenous local religion, and how he had come, you know, they lived in the same village. He had asked him, and I think he was 10 years old at the time, and he had a 12-year-old sister. Come with me. I want to go into the forest. Come with me. So he brought them, the grandfather brought them into the forest with him, and they were having a lovely time walking the pathways in the forest. And suddenly they came around a corner, and there was the source. There was the artesian well bubbling out of the earth, bubbling out of the depths of the earth. So he had studied as Plato and Aristotle, but the way he spoke about this was so moving. He said, our grandfather, seeing this, fell to his knees and went into a state of ecstasy. Went into a state of ecstasy. Was, our language is odd, huh? Was in a sense beside himself, outside himself, and deep within himself, all simultaneously. And he said, my sister and I, we were a little awestruck by this. So we stood beside him for a little while, but it continued. It continued. So after a little while, we stepped aside a little bit. We began to walk around and just wait for our grandfather, wait for him. We kind of attended to him, but we also waited for him. And finally, he came back to them as well. And he talked about how they then walked home. And the next day, his grandfather came and got them again. Said, please, you must come with me now. Yesterday you didn't have to, but today you do. You must come with me now. And he took them and he had a chicken. And he walked to the same place in the forest, fell down on his knees, went into a state of ecstasy, outside of himself, beside himself, seemed to me deep within himself. And he sacrificed the chicken. On this occasion, They simply stood and attended in wonder as to what this all meant. When he spoke about this, all to Catholic seminarians and several Anglican women who were studying for clerical orders, he just spoke about it. He just described it as a kind of wonder in his heart, a moment that had, seems to me in retrospect, and I shouldn't presume about it, I suppose, but my sense is that it had given him a profound sense of what adoration is about, what it means to be seized by the mystery of God's creation. And so that's one little response to this question of how we are addressed by God's creation. And that this is not abstract. It seizes us. And we, given God's grace, respond. The second matter, and here I'd like to perhaps tease this up in a way to have you say just a little more about it. When so much of our thinking in our time about authority has to do with professionalism, institutional authority, who's in charge, may have to do with mastery and what's the nature of mastery. So just a couple things about this, and you don't have to go very far with this if you don't want to, because what you've done is beautiful. And I don't really mean to divert it, but maybe just give you a chance to put a little accent on it. I've only spent my life really in three institutions. One is the church, the other is universities, and the third one is museums, that is institutions that are charged to care for memory and the imagination. And it's been striking to me in all three of these institutions that it seems to me there's two very distinct, I'm not sure even how to put it. It's not layers. And in some ways it isn't even spheres, but maybe it is spheres, I don't know. Well, let me put it this way. There are two distinct dimensions to authority. There is institutional authority. That is the person or persons who are charged with the maintenance of the order of the institution. But what's interesting about these three institutions, and of course the church, I think, being where it is most vividly shown, although so often where there is so little consciousness of it. But let me speak about museums and universities first. In museums and universities, you have administrative authority, responsible to see that there's no scandal, responsible to see to whatever their light is, that the institution goes about its business in a sensible way. Often leadership in these institutions completely forgets the vocation of the institution, but be that as it may arise. There's also another kind of authority. There is the authority in those institutions of the professor, the authority of the curator, the authority of artists who work within those institutions. And these distinct spheres of authority often struggle with each other. Now, within the church, it's so interesting to me because we have a highly developed sense within both the East, the Christian East, and within Catholicism of what we often call threefold ministry: the episcopacy, presbytery, the diaconate. And so often we think of it as those folks as the authorities within the institution. And of course they are in certain ways. At the same time, the church sees itself as being the bride of Christ, as being the spouse to the authority, and that the authority is Christ, is the incarnation. The authority is, and I guess here's where I was wondering if you might say a little more, where the authority in some ultimate sense is existential, is communing presence. Where there is communing presence, there is the authorship of He who is everywhere present and fillest all things, of the Spirit that is everywhere present and fillest all things. And that is the telos. It's the ground and the telos of the gathering, of the ecclesia. So we, for example, in our church, we will often say, Master, bless. Beautiful phrase, which has several layers to it. Several layers to it. So I've wondered a little bit, and when you were going to do this on authority, I was pondering this a little bit. What is a master? And here's implied in this little wandering of mine is what I really would like you to just maybe speak a little more to. What is a master? I've thought of master athletes. I've thought of master violinists. I've thought of master carpenters since my father was one. And it occurred to me a number of years ago in thinking about this, that in our time, we tend to think of mastery as somebody who's an expert or who's come to dominate or who is in control. I mean, we have all those kind of images. But what occurs to me is that the person who becomes a master, that the essential departure on that pathway is in some ways self-mastery. That is, the mastering of your passions, so that you discipline your mind, your heart, your body, your relationships in service to something you love, or in service to something that is beautiful, in service to something that is real. So the master carpenter We have some of these images in the Apostle Paul. I have become a slave of Christ. I have become a slave of Christ. The master is a slave of the gift, of the gift. So the carpenter has mastered himself, herself, for the sake of the oak, for the sake of the fir, for the sake of engaging the gifts of creation to also make that which is beautiful, has integrity, and enhances the life of others. The violinist has mastered their own life and become a servant, not only to the violin, but to the score, for the sake of having the music play them, if that grace is given at some point in the future. So I was just wondering if maybe that would give you a chance to say a touch more about the way in which we understand the synergy that's at work here that you've articulated so nicely.
That's well considered, David, and well phrased. Let me back through a few things, and then your first story. I have a question to put back to you, but I don't think well, that's not the way. I was going to say I don't think you're wrong at any one point, but that's not the way to say it. I think that each thing you say here has light in it, sometimes echoing, and sometimes just so. Beginning not with the first story, but with institutions. That distinction of authority that you observe and that you know with institutions, I think that's very important. And I think that one of the first things we need to do is to be able to discern that you set forth for us, the difference in a word being applied here and there. Sometimes it's helpful to just diversify vocabulary. And I don't like to refer in this way to other things, but for the moment, I do like to watch some satirical political shows, especially Yes Minister and The Thick of It and Veep, right? All done by done by two people. One thing one learns in let's say democracy such as the British government is that you have the prime minister who's meant to be authoritative more in the guiding sense, but then you also have a chief whip, and that name is just pretty much what it is. They keep everyone in line. If that distinction is forgotten, if the winning because we need to win, or the let's offer this as a way forward, if those are confused, then I like that I mean, numbers are always difficult, but it seems episcopacy, presbytery, the diaconate. This is true, and 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 we know this. In one of his books, John Zazilus refers to the little old ladies, the babushkas, little old ladies who were there in the church. In an Orthodox church, this often is felt as the actual source of either the chief whip or the authority, the little old ladies who have something just in their hearts. They're not good at explaining, but they're there and they're there. There's a story, Goa, you told me, I believe, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I believe about visiting the monastery and seeking conversation as one does. And then noticing too, while in conversation, that there are some people making soup over there. And we know that the one is not better than the other necessarily. When we speak about strong images in the tradition and how to integrate strong fire, it's things like this. When our Savior says, she has chosen the better part, to sit at my feet and listen rather than serve, we have to be very, very careful, because it's not a comparison. It's not like that. And serving, as you said, David, has something to do with mastery. The way that you expanded mastery beyond its kind of insistence and tyrannical into self-mastery and then service, I think is very good, especially when that service is understood to not be passive nor active, but to be a form of synergy, as you said. Yeah. One has to be extremely careful. But when one thinks of what Christ has said about the beautiful revelation of the world, and then he says, the kingdom of heaven is within you. And then he says, let the little ones come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. This is more fire. I like how Derek called it a symphony or a harmony earlier, where each moving part is important. It's not just the loudest part or the most beautiful part or what we think is the most beautiful or the most prominent, each moving part. And sometimes we don't understand how the moving part fits into it. Just like when we're thinking of how the source emerges and plays part of our life. And this is what I wanted to ask you, David, just at whatever length you wish, and others too. But going back to that first story, is that recognition, first of all, is beautifully put. And then the, as you put it, adoration is strongly felt. And then the sacrifice. For those of us unused to blood sacrifices, it might seem a strong image, difficult to integrate. But I wonder, is this, and now I'm just turning it back to you, is a sacrifice like this to be understood as part of the dance of economia within creation? Like the gift is so immense, and so here's some of our own. Is that what it is, what it means? Because it can seem difficult, and our tradition doesn't have that, right? We recognize it, and it has precedence, and it has, it's there. How does sacrifice fit in the economy of adoration and creation? Or is that a question to ask or not to ask? Because it's always a bit jarring for ears like mine. It's not, I'm not used to it. But we know that one's own experience cannot be made self-idolatrous. Just because I don't know doesn't mean, Maybe I'm asking, how do we make room for responses that we don't comprehend? And I don't mean wild responses. I mean, we can,
Yeah. Well, on that occasion, Augustine, who now has been a priest probably for a decade or two, and I haven't seen him since then, so I have no idea. But of course, at every liturgy, he has spoken the words of the sacrifice of my hands. And the whole notion of the sacrifice that ends sacrifices, the bloodless sacrifice. The vernaculars count, particulars count, and the movement of human history counts. And I don't know, but I appreciate your suggestion about the economia here. My sense is from being in the presence of that story that for him, now, when I met him, he was probably 25 years old, had done his degree in philosophy, obviously had been in North America from Nigeria for some time, had a beautiful, beautiful sensibility. Every time he spoke, it was just beautiful to hear him. He called forth that memory in a way which certainly helped me understand that sacrifice, as the ancients understood by that word, is simply to mark the sacred, to mark that which is holy, to mark that which is the mysterium tremendum, a wonder that bubbles out of God's creation, that is God's creation, bubbling, and that we are so intimately linked to. So there are 10,000 ways of responding to that. And we are also called to respond to it. This was one way of responding to it. But it was a way that phrased, I think I'm using your word properly here, sort of phrased a response as opposed to making something out of it. Said this is also at the very heart of life. And bringing his grandchildren there to say, yes, this is the heart of life. It is an amazing gift that greets us every time we come around a corner with surprise. And in the case of his grandfather, plunged him into ecstasis, outside himself, beside himself. And it seems to me, out of the depth of himself. Yeah.
He was attuned to that moment. He was ready for that moment.
Yeah.
Why don't we pause here?
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. And at the end of this month, we'll also gather again and we'll think about that marvelous word, grace, which in our particular culture has been influenced so deeply by my first hero, Martin Luther. And I think maybe Monk Seraphim had him as a hero too, I'm not sure. But Martin Luther spent so much time pondering the notion of grace. And in the Christian East and in the Hebrew Bible, Greek New Testament has a rich meaning, and within the church fathers and spiritual mothers. So we'll gather again and think about that. So thank
Very
you
good.
again, Andrew, for the beautiful unfolding.